Welcome. I just thought I'd let guys know that I plan to write a book about using the road and driving, and I am a driver trainer. I do advanced and defensive driving, and I wanted to share some insights into some of my thoughts into driving. I have various subjects that I'm going to cover over the next few months, as well as trying to write a book and working at the same time, so quite hard work. What are my goals? Well, I am trying to make driving easier, safer, using the road safer as well. So yeah, that's really my aims. I really enjoy being on the road and driving. I enjoy managing risk for businesses with drivers on the road, and I want to share some of the knowledge that I've developed over the last few years. Been in this industry about 10 years now, and I've learned a lot. It's quite a complex industry in terms of driver training, but hopefully I can share a few insights. I thought today I'd talk a little bit about van training, which is always an interesting subject. We in the UK at least can pass a UK driving test and the next day drive up to a 3.5 ton vehicle, which is pretty scary as far as I'm concerned. So yeah, I wanted to discuss some differences between van and car that some people are not familiar with. So the first thing really is possibly stating the obvious, but it's to do with blind spots. And so on a normal van, we would have, instead of a car, where in a car, yeah, you do have blind spots, but not quite so many. The space is, the space is obviously behind the vehicle. This space here is nearly completely unsighted, so very, very difficult to see. And then on top of that, obviously, you know, you've got your mirrors, and they do cover a pretty wide area to the size of the vehicle. But there's quite a significant area around here that we quite commonly call the blind side on commercial vehicles, as the driver normally sits on the right hand side in the UK at least, or vice versa abroad. And although we have a blind spot mirror which can eat into that slightly, it doesn't cover everything. On top of that, of course, assuming that the driver looks out the window, we still have a blind spot here, but it requires the driver to turn around and see it. And then on top of that, we have quite a large area at the front, just like you would probably on a car, but probably emphasised a little bit more that we can't see. Now this sounds quite boring and not really that interesting, but it becomes interesting when, of course, you're using the road around a van, or you're hiring or using a van for work, and you need to manoeuvre it in some way, whether that's forward, backwards, wherever, or into a parking space. This is one of the reasons why there is laws and recommendations that we avoid reversing at all times where possible, and in a van particularly we certainly do so. There is a school of thought, and I agree with it in the most part, where we do most of the manoeuvring in van towards the right hand side, because you can turn round and then get your head out the window if necessary without decapitating yourself to see down this side. Behind though, obviously things like bollards and posts and trees, as well as other road users, are almost completely unsighted, and of course fastidious mirror checks are very important to make sure we have that. There is a really easy solution to this for parking and manoeuvring in van, and that is very simple. If in doubt, head out the van, have a walk round before you start your manoeuvring, and to make sure it's clear, but of course that's subject to change. The other thing with van, which seems quite obvious again, but maybe it's not, is the size of it. And you'd be surprised how many other road users don't really think of this, particularly where we're talking in locations where we have issues with trees, overhanging trees and things like that. So we commonly see roads where we have trees either side, or similar. Very poor drawing, but you get the idea. Is it's where we got the trees either side, where we have to pass, instead of your normal line in a vehicle, in a car for example, where your height isn't that high, in your normal driving position you could argue, we have to be a little bit further out in the road because of course we've got that height issue with the trees. So yeah, that's one thing. More importantly though, in the UK at least, we have circular signs or potentially warning signs, but more importantly the circular signs, which either give us height limit, width limit or restrictions. We also have weight limit, or potentially in some cases overhang issues as well, that we need to think about. Unfortunately, most sort of car drivers, if you like, or motorcyclists won't necessarily highlight those, and it does happen sometimes whereby I've got a large vehicle in front, I can see a bridge and I don't think they have read the sign, so I just back off a little bit before they clobber the bridge. It has happened. Luckily the last time it happened, the truck driver involved stopped. But we don't always necessarily think about that. So reading those height, width restrictions and also the width of the road. One of the problems, of course, with that is, again, sounds obvious, but just making sure we're clear. On a car at least, you know, the wing mirrors do stick out, but not as much as a van. Because of the blind spots, we need those larger mirrors. Therefore, mirrors, particularly where you've got two vehicles of similar, are subject to a lot of strikes. And easily hit, and so therefore it's just taking your time through those sections where it's particularly narrow. And again, other road users don't necessarily have empathy with van drivers and think, oh, you can make it through there. Well, yes, they can, but the mirrors might be a little bit more tricky. Vehicle checks, of course, checking out, you know, vehicle, the tyres, under bonnet checks, etc. Should of course be done as a matter of course whether you're driving whatever. Usually though in a van, this forms part and parcel of a company vehicle, and therefore you could argue is a little bit more important. So that's something to have a think about. Most people are not aware of this, but certainly in the UK, where we have a national speed limit and we have a single lane carriageway or a dual carriageway, but not necessarily motorway, but we'll make a note of that. In car, single lane carriageway national speed limit is 60, and then we have a double 70 for those two. But in van, and when we say about van, it's above 2 tonne, and it's non-car derived, so it's not derived, it's like not a Fiesta van or an Astra van or something like that. It's a proper van, a Transit Connect, that type of thing. These speed limits change, these two here. That one becomes 50 and this one becomes 60, but the 70 remains the same for the motorway. Not quite sure why, but there we are. And so therefore these two tend to catch a lot of van drivers out. And again, if you're in doubt on that one, I tend to go with those two anyway in terms of maximum speed. All the other speed limits still apply, but the reason for that is vans tend to take a lot longer to stop because you have that weight issue in terms of carrying extra load. Whilst we're on that subject, most car drivers that are used to driving cars are used to very good handling nowadays, particularly with modern vehicles. They're fantastic. And we certainly, as we go through these videos, I'm going to talk a bit about ESP and traction control and things like that. But in van, of course, particularly, we have an issue with the weight of the vehicle and the fact it's high-sided, and therefore much more likely to have a rollover situation, and it's going to be affected by the wind a lot more. And things like that. So in terms of the size of the van, in terms of squeezing through a gap, yeah, that's going to be difficult. But on top of that, we've also got that handling characteristics, the high centre of gravity. So in order to keep the van stable, we need to make sure the tyres are really good, but also keep the stability of the vehicle in terms of smooth handling and things like that. The other thing that I tend to encourage van drivers to do, as per all road users, is consider using hearing as a real clue in terms of what might be happening next. And we talked about the blind spots you saw at the start. If you can't see very much behind you, of course you maybe need to get out, but what you can also do is have the window down slightly so you can hear a little bit more around you, which doesn't necessarily compensate for it, but it certainly helps. The other thing is vans tend to be, not necessarily, but tend to be shared vehicles. So of course, going back to vehicle checks, it's really important that if you shared it with somebody else, and okay, so your colleague's been taking the van for this week, but you're now using it. Certainly, you'd want to have a check before you went out to make sure that you were happy that that vehicle was safe. A lot of vans are fitted with speed restrictions. The laws are a little bit complicated as we get down that route, but that can obviously affect whether or not they are allowed in the outside lane of the motorway, and also the ability to be able to overtake. So sometimes in a car we don't always have that empathy towards other road users in vans who could have that issue in terms of overtaking on the motorway or what have you. A lot of vans are restricted somewhere between 56 and 62, and possibly even up to 70 mile an hour. And it does restrict you in terms of getting out of an issue, and a lot of van drivers say to me that they don't like it for that reason. But again, driving faster inside a van, it takes much longer to stop, and we do need to consider that too. So it really is a balance, and companies are taking their measures to make sure that incidents don't occur. Because of the blind spots, we tend to encourage van drivers and all road users to face out of the space, because, and in fact the highway code sort of backs that up as well, in terms of so that we can see further out of space, but it also helps others see in terms of us. So if we have parking spaces facing out of the space as opposed to facing in, particularly with those large blind spots. And I know we have a blind spot behind, and I'll come to that. Obviously, we're going to be able to see what's coming on the main section of road more importantly. We can scan this area, and of course that's prone to change. We could argue less so than the main road. There is an issue in terms of loading, and I understand that, but again, we can choose which space we choose. But that's one of the reasons why most van operators will tend to face out of the space, mainly for view. It's also more economical, and it's also more manoeuvrable that way as well. On top of that, we also have a much quicker, more rapid getaway if we need to head out somewhere and make a delivery, albeit that shouldn't be the most important driver for it, but it certainly allows access for us to make quick exits. The other thing is a lot of van companies will have or people that run vans will tend to have a buddy with them, or a guide in terms of navigation, but also as a banksman to enable to help people into a space if it's a bit tight, and to get out and double check, and so that can be very, very helpful. Vans also on vehicle checks need to have marker lights if they're a certain length and a certain overhang at the back. There will be marker lights usually in those sorts of locations, obviously much larger on the picture, to sort of identify the length of the vehicle. So something to look out for. Loading and unloading is another consideration in terms of making sure things are tied down. Again, with all vehicles we should ensure that items are tied down, but one of the difficulties is that if we don't ensure that, particularly flatbeds as well, especially in flatbeds, but even inside vans, things move around in the interior. Now these aren't sort of generally light things inside vans, although they can be bulky and light. They tend to be more heavy, hence the van. So in which case that has to be tied down. I mean, I say it has to be, it doesn't have to be, but if it isn't, it's likely to fall off, and that can cause issues. So making sure we have ratchet straps over things and that sort of thing. The other thing is of course, loading and unloading is quite dangerous really in terms of the human body. We want to make sure that we don't ping any our back, and again, trip hazards. So we tend to encourage holding onto the vehicle as we get in, something called a 3-point contact, where we have 2 points plus our feet so we don't fall over. Quite important that we do that. And again, in terms of items inside the vehicle, we want to make sure the doors are locked and secure, and that the doors aren't open or not likely to open. So something to have a think about. I have seen many van cabs that have dangerous items like screwdrivers and ratchets and things like that. Obviously tools, because it's that type of a vehicle. However, on rollovers or heavy braking or similar, we're going to have issues with those things moving around the cab. So making sure stuff is organised and tied down and secure is even more important probably than in car, where okay, we have a boot and we can tie down them items, but they tend to be more heavier and tools inside vans. And of course, going back to blind spots again, we have issues with cyclists in terms of it's much harder to see them cyclists, particularly as we have the blind side on the offside on this side of the vehicle, and invariably so at the moment. Cyclists tend to come up the inside of vehicles. I'd generally prefer cyclists to come this side, or even better at all, to keep with the traffic. There is a book called Cyclecraft, which I highly recommend for any cyclists. I'm a real advocate of cyclists and enjoy sharing the road with them. However, we need to make sure we're looking out for them, and that's why your really good mirror checks are critical. And I've seen plenty of videos of late showing where mistakes have been made either by the cyclist or the van driver or both. A lot of vans, as we said a moment ago, have blind spot mirrors, which does open out the view on that left hand side, which tend to look like this. That's the blind spot mirror there, and then this is the main part of the side mirror. And of course you don't generally have a main mirror in the centre, but you can do. Again, some of these move so that it can be set up correctly or more accurately, and some of them don't, but this mirror is absolutely essential. And if you've got a van, even if you've got a Fiesta or Astra van with a standard mirror, I'd certainly recommend getting yourself an additional blind spot mirror for that side. Very, very difficult to see. Part of that, of course, happens to be an issue at a Y junction, which is, let me get this right, yeah, so at these type of junctions, where the van, if he came in at your sort of what you may expect him to do or her to do, is to come in at that angle, then the view down this side is restricted. Whereby with any vehicle, and particularly with a van, we tend to encourage you to come in at, that's probably overemphasised, at a 90-degree angle, so that we get a much wider scope of view towards the left, for example. Obviously we need to check both sides, and maybe in front and behind and all the rest of it, but we want to get that view on a Y approach junction. And again, that's maybe similar on a slip road as well, which is particularly difficult as the van's moving towards the left, and that blind side being down the left hand side. Van drivers tend to be suffer from the difficulty of the fact that it's a work vehicle, and of course there's added pressures involved with that. In terms of working, we need to make sure that there's adequate time to make the journey, plus a break, etc. But of course the job needs to be done as well, so that's quite a difficult one to manage. And again, you've got things like parking restrictions, understanding when we can't load or unload at certain locations. We've got things like WL lines, we've got marks down the pavement, which are also restrictions as well on loading, red routes and things like that. Certainly worth reading up on the highway code. Very often vans will tend to have beacons as well on the roof, the amber flashing lights, which we should check on our vehicle checks. The van as well tends to swing out when we do a turn, and it's definitely something to be mindful of. And again, as the van turns and we pivot here, this back end here, it tends to swing out as we do the turn, and so therefore that section there, particularly on a right turn for example at traffic lights, can be quite a risk. And finally, of course, we have performance of the vehicle is going to be hugely affected, usually not quite as quick as a car, although they get in there, they're pretty damn quick. And also licensing, most drivers in the UK at least, unless you take an additional test, can only go up to 3.5 tonne. So in terms of driver licensing, yeah, most drivers in the UK can only go up to about 3.5 tonne, but you do need to check your licence, and again check on DVLA website if you're not entirely sure. Each country, European or otherwise, will have a different restriction on what the weight limit of the vehicle that you are legally entitled to drive. And some people don't realise that, particularly when hiring vehicles or maybe even going for work, where the vehicles are a little bit larger. And I have rejected one vehicle because I was asked to go out and do training in it, but I don't have a licence for that. So definitely worth checking, and you get into real legal implications there too. So that gives you a little synopsis on van training. Evidently there's a lot more to it than that, but those are the key differences between van and car. I'm sure that there's more. I have a list here just to keep my head on it, but certainly there's a lot to think about. And thank you for listening. I hope I haven't bored you silly, because van training probably isn't the most exciting thing in the world. But keep listening and watching, because we've got some more series coming up on vehicle dynamics, and our emotions whilst driving, and how to be more defensive or advanced. Some really useful techniques. So keep in touch, and thank you very much for listening. Don't forget to click subscribe below. Yeah, and keep listening. Thank you very much.